What happens when one careless joke about loyalty turns into legal action? My husband didn't yell, didn't throw things, didn't even argue. Instead, he gathered proof, went to HR, and handed me court papers while I was still laughing with my friends. I am Seraphine Doral, 32 years old, a payroll clerk who always thought keeping attention on me was a harmless necessity. And now I am the villain in every family conversation. People keep saying I should have seen this coming, but I did not, because I believed my small jokes about his friend Lion were clever ways of showing wit, not betrayals. At the beginning, I told myself humor keeps love alive, and I insisted Adrian's silence was just moodiness, but his silence turned into folders of receipts and reports, stacked carefully where I could not reach. My sister Camille told me I was bold. My mother told me men cannot take jokes, and my friend group clapped whenever I teased Adrian. But his mother Helena looked at me with pure contempt every time, and I never cared until now. Lion was Adrian's close friend from college, and also his colleague, and I made him my tool for laughter, claiming often that he treated me better than my husband, thinking everyone would take it as playful nonsense. Adrian never shouted, never accused, never pushed me into fights. He only went to human resources, collected screenshots, and scheduled meetings with a lawyer, and I kept pretending he was simply insecure. Now the card machine rejects my purchases, the custody schedule controls my time with Alara, and the judge's voice is louder in my memory than all the laughs I once collected from my audience. I still feel wronged because I never crossed a physical line with Lion, but Adrian turned every smile, every comment, every social post into evidence. And now I am standing in the story that I created without ever planning for this ending. The first time it truly began was during a dinner at our home when Lion came by after work with Adrian, and I thought it would be amusing to tease Adrian in front of him because I wanted to feel admired. I casually mentioned that Lion treated me better than my husband, and the room went still. Then Camille laughed loudly, saying she always noticed how Lion seemed more thoughtful, and suddenly, everyone was laughing while Adrian stared at his plate. I told myself it was nothing, that Adrian was being overly serious, and I explained to him afterward that I was just making people smile. But he did not respond with words, only with quiet eyes that watched me too closely. My mother later said, "Men need to loosen up when women shine in company," and Camille sent me messages telling me I was brave and hilarious. But Helena told Adrian that words like mine leave stains on reputations, especially inside workplaces where Lion was also present. I dismissed her warning and said she was jealous of my confidence. Then I convinced myself that Adrian secretly liked seeing me as the center of attention, even if he acted offended. When the next group outing happened at a restaurant, I doubled down, mentioning again that Lion showed me more respect. And this time, Lion looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, while Adrian went silent again, finishing his meal quickly. On the way home, I told him he was controlling my humor, and I said he was making a big issue out of nothing, and he stayed completely quiet, which I labeled as sulking. That night, I noticed him writing something at his desk, sliding papers into a folder labeled with dates, and I rolled my eyes, thinking he was being dramatic. In reality, he was recording each moment, each joke, each time I tried to turn him into a punchline, while I was convinced my light-heartedness made me clever. At family gatherings, I repeated the same lines, making Adrian appear dull while Lion looked uneasy, and Camille clapped along while Helena gave me icy stares. I kept insisting to anyone who questioned me that it was harmless, that my husband was too sensitive, and I told myself constantly that the laughter of friends meant more than his hurt expression. But Adrian's silence grew heavier each week, his distance sharper, and I still believed wrongly that he would eventually apologize for not appreciating my playful energy. When I think back now, I can see the turning point came when Adrian began carrying himself differently, no longer arguing, no longer even asking me to stop, but instead treating every moment like he was collecting data. He started keeping his phone face down and his folders locked in his briefcase, and I thought it was paranoia, but really, he was building a case while I kept mocking him in front of others. At a birthday dinner for a friend, I leaned across the table and announced that Lion was more attentive than Adrian ever managed to be. And everyone laughed awkwardly. Then Lion flushed and looked down at his plate, while Adrian simply folded his napkin and excused himself early. I told the table he was pouting because he could not handle jokes, and Camille defended me loudly, saying men always sulk when women outshine them, which made me feel justified again. Helena, however, pulled me aside afterward and said very calmly that a woman who humiliates her husband in front of his colleagues should not be surprised when consequences arrive, and I waved her off, accusing her of being old-fashioned and bitter. At home, Adrian said nothing, just packed Alara's lunch quietly and left earlier than usual for work, and when I asked if he was angry, he only said he had meetings, and I told myself he was sulking again. I kept leaning into the attention from Lion, sending playful comments in group chats where Adrian could see them, and telling myself it was harmless because Lion never responded directly. But the silence from both men had different meanings. Lion avoided me more and more, sitting farther away during gatherings, while Adrian stopped reacting at all, which should have been a warning, but I mistook it for weakness. I explained to Camille that Adrian was letting his insecurities control him, and that I needed to keep my spirit alive, and she told me to never tone myself down for a man. My mother repeated that Adrian should be proud to have a wife admired by others, but Helena began spending more time with Adrian and Alara, offering to help with school drop-offs, and I realized she was preparing for something behind my back. Then came the first email from HR that I glimpsed on Adrian's phone, a subject line marked confidential, and my stomach turned, but I told myself he would never take family drama into the office. A week later, he mentioned casually that HR wanted statements about professional boundaries, and I accused him of trying to punish me at work, but he only said processes had to be followed, which made me furious because he sounded like a manager instead of a husband. I tried to charm him into softening, cooking his favorite dinner, and brushing off the tension with a laugh, but he remained polite and distant, thanking me mechanically while sliding more papers into that folder afterward. During a barbecue at Helena's backyard, with neighbors present, I repeated again that Lion treated me better, raising my voice just enough for the crowd, and this time, the silence afterward felt colder than ever. Adrian placed his plate down, told Helena thank you for the food, and quietly left with Alara, while Lion made an excuse to leave shortly after. I stood there smiling, insisting to everyone that it was only a bit of fun, but no one laughed, not even Camille, who usually backed me up. When I confronted her later, she admitted maybe the joke was old and people were uncomfortable, and I snapped at her for betraying me, though inside, I felt the ground shift. Not long after, Adrian began spending nights in the guest room, moving his clothes carefully, not slamming doors, just withdrawing piece by piece. I asked him why he was punishing me, and he replied that boundaries had to be respected, and I accused him of gaslighting me because I believed he was twisting normal jokes into betrayals. But the next day, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope, and inside was a notice about temporary financial restrictions and an upcoming hearing for custody arrangements. My hands shook as I read that he had filed to freeze joint accounts, reassign parenting schedules, and request non-disparagement orders, and suddenly I understood that his silence had been the sound of preparation. I called Camille and told her Adrian was trying to ruin me, but she only said maybe I had pushed too far, and that she could not get involved, and I realized even she was slipping away from my side. My mother said lawyers love creating drama, but her voice was less certain than before, and my father kept to himself entirely, avoiding eye contact when I asked for support. Meanwhile, Helena looked triumphant, carrying Alara's backpack into her car with Adrian standing beside her, and I hated how calm and dignified they appeared compared to my frantic explanations. I told myself over and over that I never crossed any real line, that Lion was only ever a tool for humor, but Adrian's documents painted me as someone cruel, reckless, and untrustworthy, and every screenshot looked worse than I remembered. The weight of laughter that once felt like my crown had become heavy chains dragging me down in front of HR, in front of family, and now in front of the court. And through it all, Adrian never raised his voice, never called me names, never gave me the fight I thought I wanted. He only gave me consequences, and those consequences spoke louder than any insult ever could. The mediation room smelled of stale coffee and photocopied paper, and I walked in expecting to argue and persuade, but instead I found Adrian sitting calmly with his lawyer, his binder stacked high with pages that documented every little thing I thought had been harmless. The mediator explained that we were here to discuss parenting time, financial stability, and behavior going forward, and I tried to lighten the mood by joking that the whole thing was an overreaction. But no one laughed, not even the mediator, who just wrote notes with a steady hand. Adrian's lawyer began listing my comments at dinners, at barbecues, at restaurants, even screenshots of social media posts where I had tagged Lion with playful captions suggesting he cared for me more than my husband, and I felt the blood drain from my face as they read them aloud like evidence of a crime. I tried to explain that it was humor, exaggeration, a way of keeping gatherings alive, but the mediator interrupted and asked how those comments affected Adrian's professional image, given Lion was also his colleague, and suddenly my excuses sounded paper-thin. I said that Lion was a friend and nothing more, that we had never crossed any physical line, but HR had already sent a report noting that my behavior created an appearance of impropriety, and that Lion himself felt uncomfortable being dragged into personal jokes. Adrian remained quiet through all of this, his lawyer doing the speaking, his hands folded calmly, and I hated how dignified he looked, like he had risen above me while I was scrambling. When it was my turn, I tried turning the tables, saying Adrian was insecure and controlling, but the mediator asked if insecurity justified filing formal HR complaints and building evidence, and I had no good answer. I blamed gossip, I blamed old-fashioned views, I even tried to say that my friends encouraged me, but the documents in front of us had dates, times, and screenshots that no cheering sister could erase. Then the financial side came, and I learned that Adrian had already moved his paycheck into a new account, closed the joint card, and filed for a temporary financial restraining order so I could not drain our savings. I said he was punishing me unfairly, but the lawyer calmly said it was protection, not punishment, and the mediator nodded. Parenting time was proposed as 50-50, with exchanges at school to avoid conflict, and I nearly shouted that he was stealing Alara from me, but they reminded me that equal time was fair, and that stability was most important for the child. Adrian looked at me once then, not with anger but with steady resolve, and I realized that he had prepared for every angle while I had only prepared excuses. When I left the room that day, my mother was waiting in the hallway, saying the judge would surely see through the drama, but her voice trembled and she avoided my eyes. Camille texted later, saying she hoped things worked out, but she did not call, and I knew she was distancing herself from the fallout. Helena, on the other hand, hugged Adrian and took Alara for ice cream, smiling like justice had been served, and the sight made me want to scream, yet I had no words that would change anything. Back at home, I found the old cookbook open on the counter, and on top of it lay the original card from the flowers I had once hidden, the one in block letters that Colin had sent, and I realized Adrian had placed it there deliberately. It was a reminder that he had never forgotten, never forgiven, and that every small choice I made had been collected and kept as proof. I picked it up, tracing the fading ink, and felt the weight of my own arrogance pressing down. That night, the doorbell camera chimed again, and I watched on the screen as Adrian set down Alara's backpack neatly on the porch, checked the strap, and walked away without ringing, without knocking, without speaking. The silence was heavier than any argument we had ever had, and I finally understood that his revenge had not been loud or cruel. It had been lawful, calm, and devastating, leaving me trapped in the consequences of the story I had written with my own. Careless words. The courtroom itself felt colder than I expected, not because of the air, but because of the distance between what I imagined would happen and what actually unfolded in front of me. I had pictured myself convincing the judge that Adrian was exaggerating, that he was overreacting to harmless jokes, But the reality was that his lawyer spoke with precision while mine scrambled to keep up. They laid out the evidence piece by piece, screenshots of my posts comparing Lion to Adrian, records of dinners where multiple witnesses confirmed I had mocked my husband publicly, even a written statement from Lion himself saying he felt uncomfortable being drawn into my games. Hearing Lion's name in that way made my stomach twist, because I had always assumed he would stay silent, but instead, he had protected himself and distanced from me. I tried to argue that I never cheated, that no line had been crossed beyond words, but the judge stopped me quickly, saying the issue was not physical betrayal, but humiliation, workplace disruption, and the well-being of our daughter. That phrase cut deeper than anything, because suddenly, Alara's name was linked to my behavior, and I realized this was not only about me and Adrian anymore. The judge explained that when one parent undermines the other's dignity publicly, it affects the child's sense of stability, and I felt everyone's eyes on me as if I had no defense. My lawyer tried to redirect, saying it was simply a clash of personalities and humor styles, but the documents Adrian provided told a story of consistency, me mocking, him recording, and eventually him protecting. The orders came down in a steady rhythm, each one hitting harder than the last. Shared custody, equal parenting time, exchanges at school or Helena's home to avoid scenes. Non-disparagement clauses, forbidding me from speaking negatively in front of Alara, and financial control remaining with Adrian under court review. I felt my chest tighten when I heard the words restraining order on major assets, because it meant I could not touch the savings account I once thought of as half mine. My protests sounded shrill even to myself, saying that he was making me look like a villain, that I only wanted laughter, but the judge responded calmly that responsibility for consequences falls on the one who makes the choices. When the session ended, Adrian did not gloat, did not even glance at me with triumph. He simply signed the papers, collected a copy of the schedule, and thanked the court staff with quiet politeness. His lawyer shook his hand firmly, while mine whispered that we could appeal certain items, but the tone suggested little hope. Outside in the hallway, Helena held Alara's hand and told her that Daddy had finished important work, and my daughter looked at him with pride I could not interrupt. My mother tried to assure me that nothing was final, but she spoke more softly than before, as though even she believed the shift was permanent. Camille sent a short message that evening, saying she was sorry things had gone this far, but I knew she had already withdrawn, leaving me without allies. Back at the house, I walked into the kitchen and found the schedule folder on the table where Adrian had left copies for me. Inside were health insurance cards, after-school contact lists, and a calendar marked with color-coded weeks dividing time with Alara. Everything was neat, precise, impossible to argue against without looking selfish. I sat staring at those pages for hours, realizing that my habit of chasing attention and jokes had given Adrian the moral high ground I thought I owned. That night, the familiar chime of the doorbell camera rang again. I checked the screen and saw Adrian stepping onto the porch, setting down Alara's small bag with her homework and pajamas inside. He straightened the strap, pressed the bag gently against the door, and walked away without a single glance at the camera. He did not ring the bell, did not knock, did not call out, just turned and left with the same calm silence that had carried him through every stage of this battle. The silence was unbearable, more punishing than shouting, because it told me clearly that I no longer had any place in his world except the one outlined on the court schedule. And standing there holding the folder of orders, I finally understood that the laughter I had chased so recklessly had cost me everything that was steady and real. After the court ruling, life became a rhythm, dictated not by me, but by the papers signed and stamped in that cold room, and every week felt like I was living inside the consequences of my own performance. The schedule controlled when I saw Alara, and even though it was equal time, it felt like half a life, because every moment was measured and checked against the calendar Adrian had created so carefully. He picked her up at school with calm efficiency, his clothes neat, his tone polite, and the teachers admired his consistency, while I arrived flustered, trying too hard to appear cheerful, and I could feel the difference in how people looked at us. When Alara ran into his arms, I told myself she was only happy because of new routines, not because he was the stronger parent, but the quiet truth pressed in every time she skipped toward him without hesitation. At work, I noticed whispers fading into silence, colleagues no longer asking about weekends, no longer sending me memes or invitations to lunches. I knew they had heard about the HR investigation, and though nothing official was said to me, the shift was obvious. Lion had been reassigned, his name no longer spoken in meetings, and the absence cut sharper than I expected because it reminded me that even he had chosen self-preservation over me. I told myself he owed me loyalty, but really he owed nothing, and his written statement had been another nail in my defense. HR sent a final letter reminding me of workplace boundaries and professional conduct, and I laughed bitterly when I read it, because the words were polite, yet they felt like a sentence carved in stone. My mother still tried to soothe me, repeating that lawyers feed on fear and that judges can change their minds. But even she had begun lowering her voice when she spoke, as though she no longer fully believed in my version. Camille avoided me almost completely now, sending occasional texts about her own life, but never asking about mine, and I realized she wanted distance from the wreckage she once encouraged. Helena, of course, stood firmly with Adrian, taking pride in his quiet victory, and I hated how dignified she appeared, as though she had known all along that my energy would collapse under its own weight. My father avoided the subject entirely, helping with small chores but never addressing the reality, which made the silence worse than any lecture. At night, the house felt empty, in a way that was heavier than physical absence. The guest room where Adrian used to sleep before moving out still held the faint smell of his suits, and I would stand in the doorway remembering how I had mocked him, thinking silence was weakness when it was actually strength. The cookbook still lay on the counter, the faded flower card placed on top like a relic of everything I had tried to dismiss. I picked it up often, tracing the ink, convincing myself it was meaningless, yet knowing it had been the first crack that grew into a canyon. The doorbell camera became the symbol of my downfall. Each week when Adrian brought Alara's bag, the soft chime rang through the house, and I would watch him on the screen setting the bag down, checking the strap, and walking away without pause. He never knocked, never lingered, never spoke a word, just left her things and returned to his car with that same steady silence. I once craved dramatic fights, imagined that raised voices meant passion, but his quiet distance was sharper than any argument could have been. Every chime reminded me that I had been replaced by a system of orders and schedules that gave him dignity and me boundaries. I kept telling myself that I had only wanted spark, that I had never truly betrayed him, that it was all just harmless teasing. But the truth was that my laughter had been cruel, and everyone else had seen it long before I did. The laughter that once made me feel powerful had turned into the very evidence that broke me, printed and highlighted inside his binder, transformed into legal documents that rewrote our family. And now every exchange, every quiet drop-off, every polite nod at school reminded me that my husband's lawful revenge was complete, and that I was living in the silence I once thought I controlled. The days after the final orders felt like moving through a script I had not written, where every action was already decided and my role was smaller than ever before. The schedule dictated when I had Alara. The bank statements reminded me that Adrian controlled the money, and the HR letter stayed pinned on the fridge as a warning I could not ignore. I told myself that structure was temporary, that things would loosen, but each week proved me wrong. Adrian thrived inside the rules, carrying himself with quiet authority, while I stumbled, trying to appear unaffected. Teachers praised his organization. Neighbors nodded approvingly when they saw him with Alara, and I could feel the shift in how people viewed us, as if he had risen above the noise and I had become the problem no one wanted to mention. At work, the silence was worse than gossip. No one laughed with me anymore. No one lingered by my desk, and the invitations to lunch had disappeared completely. I noticed colleagues glanced away when I entered the break room, and I knew they remembered the investigation, even if it was never spoken aloud. Lion's absence hung in the air like a shadow. He had been reassigned quietly, and his statement lay somewhere inside Adrian's binder, proof that he wanted nothing to do with me. I once believed he enjoyed the attention, but the truth was he wanted distance, and he got it, leaving me behind to face consequences alone. My family divided in ways I had not predicted. My mother still repeated that I only wanted joy, that I had been punished too harshly, but she sounded less certain each time. My father stayed quiet, fixing shelves or carrying bags, never giving me eye contact when I sought reassurance. Camille avoided me almost completely now, her encouragement replaced with silence, and I resented her for stepping away after helping me believe I was bold. Helena, on the other hand, became more visible, attending school events with Adrian, holding Alara's hand like she was protecting her from me, and people admired that steadiness. I hated her for it, but I also knew she was right about everything she had warned me of. The house itself became a constant reminder of absence. Adrian's shoes no longer stood by the door, his steady typing no longer filled the office at night, and even his silence was gone, replaced by emptiness. The guest room felt like a hollow space, carrying only the faint memory of his suits. The cookbook with the faded flower card remained on the counter, and I could not bring myself to move it, as though it had become part of the punishment. Each time I touched the brittle card, I remembered how I had laughed, how I had insisted it was nothing, and how that single choice had become the foundation of everything he used against me. The doorbell chime finished the story each week. I would hear it and watch on the screen as Adrian appeared briefly, setting down Alara's bag, adjusting it carefully, then walking away without hesitation. He never knocked, never waved at the camera, never paused, just performed his part of the schedule with precision and silence. I once believed passion came from arguments, from fire and noise, but his silence was more final than any fight could have been. It was the silence of a man who no longer needed words, who had turned evidence and law into his voice, leaving me with nothing but fading laughter that now sounded cruel even in my own memory. And so I stood, holding schedules and papers, realizing that the outcome had been sealed the moment I treated humiliation as entertainment, and that Adrian's quiet, lawful revenge was complete. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.